The United States launched a trade war against Canada.
Caused by a growing trade war with Canada.
The U.S. will add an additional 25% tariff.
Canada just did something that caught even Europe off guard. For decades, the U.S. assumed it had a secure and reliable energy partner right across the border. But now, Canada's new strategy is raising eyebrows, not just in Washington, but in Brussels too. What happens when one of the world's richest energy exporters suddenly pivots toward Europe and Asia, leaving its closest ally scrambling? Could the U.S. actually lose its northern energy lifeline? And is the EU truly ready to take its place? Let's break down what Canada just did, why it matters, and what it means for global power shifts in energy and diplomacy. Canada's energy awakening. Canada isn't just a beautiful land of forests, lakes, and moose. It's a resource giant with enormous reserves of oil sands, natural gas, uranium, and clean hydroelectric power. Canada is one of the few countries that can meet both fossil fuel and clean energy demands. The Alberta oil sands alone are estimated to hold over 165 billion barrels of crude oil, placing Canada third in the world for proven oil reserves, behind only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, the country ranks among the top 5 global producers of natural gas, with key reserves concentrated in British Columbia and Alberta. On the clean energy front, hydroelectricity provides more than 60% of Canada's electricity generation, largely sourced from provinces like Quebec, British Columbia, and Manitoba. For decades, that energy flowed mainly south, to the United States. The two nations built pipelines, grids, and a deeply interconnected infrastructure. It was a marriage of convenience until it wasn't. Canada exported more than 3.5 million barrels of oil per day to the U.S. as of recent years.
Recently, when U.S. President Donald Trump imposed and then suspended tariffs on all Canadian products,
President Trump has paused 25% tariffs on U.S. imports from Mexico and Canada.
After Canada was given a pause on tariffs for most sectors, now there's a new threat from the U.S. president.
Canada's defense minister said today Ottawa is prepared to contribute peacekeepers to protect Ukraine's border with Russia should there be a ceasefire.
Accounting for over half of America's crude oil imports. The integration is so tight that cross-border infrastructure, like the Keystone Pipeline system and Enbridge's main line, has become critical to both countries' energy security. Yet, this heavy reliance also left Canada exposed to U.S. political decisions, trade disputes, and shifting regulatory climates. As the global energy landscape evolved, driven by climate goals, market volatility, and geopolitical tensions, Canada began to reassess its role. It realized that relying so heavily on a single market, even one as large as the United States, could be a strategic vulnerability. The push toward diversification wasn't just economic, it was existential. Tariffs that tipped the balance. Things began to crack during Donald Trump's presidency. Trade wars flared up. Tariffs were threatened, suspended, then reimposed on Canadian steel, aluminum, and even oil. For Canadian policymakers, this wasn't just a warning, it was a wake-up call. Canada had long relied on preferential access to the U.S. market under trade agreements like NAFTA and later USMCA. But when those agreements were challenged or undermined, it forced Canadian officials to rethink the entire framework of their economic dependence. The steel and aluminum tariffs, imposed under the guise of national security, were particularly stinging. Canada, often hailed as America's closest ally, found itself on the receiving end of aggressive protectionist policies. Canadian manufacturers, exporters, and policymakers quickly recognized the vulnerabilities of over-reliance on a single dominant trade partner. The uncertainty shook investor confidence and triggered concerns about supply chain disruptions across key sectors. For the oil and gas industry, fears grew that similar tariffs or even export restrictions could hit pipelines and petroleum trade next. Why rely so heavily on one partner, especially one that could turn hostile overnight? This moment catalyzed a new wave of Canadian trade diplomacy.
No room left for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow.
Ottawa launched strategic efforts to deepen ties with Europe and Asia, positioning Canada as a reliable and stable alternative energy partner. Trade missions increased, new memoranda of understanding were signed, and diplomatic discussions about energy corridors and infrastructure financing picked up speed. That's when Canada began seriously looking east and west toward Europe and Asia. What had once been considered long-term diversification goals suddenly became urgent national imperatives. Enter the EU, surprised and excited. Canada already had a powerful trade deal with the European Union, CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, but the full potential of that agreement remained untapped until now. Suddenly, Canadian companies are looking to Europe not just for car parts and wine, but for oil and gas sales. The EU, desperate to reduce dependence on Russian fossil fuels, is eager to listen. The war in Ukraine has upended the energy security paradigm in Europe. Countries like Germany, Italy, and even France, which once imported significant volumes of natural gas and oil from Russia, are now scrambling to diversify their energy sources. Canada's reputation as a stable democracy, its adherence to environmental standards, and its reliable supply chain make it a highly attractive partner. Moreover, CETA already provides Canadian firms with a major advantage: preferential access to EU markets with reduced or eliminated tariffs on energy products and industrial goods. The agreement also facilitates regulatory alignment and reduces barriers in government procurement. This means Canadian energy firms can compete on nearly equal footing with EU-based producers. Large European utilities and refineries have already begun initiating exploratory talks with Canadian exporters. In the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, there's growing interest in establishing direct LNG shipping routes with Canadian ports on the Atlantic. Some analysts argue that Canada's vast reserves of LNG could offer a more politically and environmentally acceptable source of gas compared to American or Qatari supplies. Could Canada become Europe's next major energy supplier?
We've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore. No, I'm not going to bend at all. Aluminum or steel or cars, we're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to. In the case of Canada, we're spending $200 billion a year to subsidize Canada. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. I have many friends in Canada.
It's no longer just a possibility. It's quickly becoming a strategic necessity. What this means for the U.S. The U.S. is still the world's largest oil and gas producer. But here's the catch. Much of its refining infrastructure, especially in the Midwest, is built for heavy crude, the kind Canada specializes in. Refineries in states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have long been configured to process Canadian bitumen and heavy synthetic crude. If Canada redirects its exports toward Europe or Asia, these refineries would either face underutilization or be forced into costly reconfigurations to handle lighter crudes. That transition could take years and billions in investment, further tightening already strained global supply chains. Losing access to Canada's low-cost, steady supply would force the U.S. to turn to more expensive or unstable regions like Venezuela or the Middle East. That's not just a logistical problem, it's a geopolitical risk. The U.S. would have to manage relationships with regimes that carry significant political baggage, often in regions prone to instability, sanctions, or fluctuating output. And then there's electricity. Canada powers entire regions of the U.S. through cross-border grids. States like New York, Vermont, and Minnesota rely heavily on Canadian hydropower to meet climate goals and stabilize their power markets. If energy flows were rerouted or throttled, it could affect electricity prices and availability, especially during peak demand seasons. Additionally, the loss of Canadian natural gas, which currently accounts for about 9% of U.S. consumption, would place extra pressure on domestic supply. That could force the U.S. to dip further into its reserves or raise prices to maintain exports to Europe. The ripple effects are vast, from fuel costs at the pump to geopolitical strategy in the Middle East. Canada's pivot could fundamentally alter America's energy calculus. Canada's grand diversification plan. Canada isn't just thinking about oil, it's thinking big. Plans for liquefied natural gas, LNG, terminals on the West Coast could open direct pipelines to Asia. Agreements with Japan and South Korea are already under discussion. Meanwhile, critical minerals needed for electric vehicles like cobalt and lithium are also on the table. Major projects such as LNG Canada in British Columbia represent one of the country's most ambitious efforts to tap into global LNG demand. With Phase 1 nearing completion and other terminals like Woodfibre LNG and Tilbury LNG under construction or consideration, Canada could become one of the world's top LNG exporters within a decade. These projects are not just export terminals, they're hubs of infrastructure, job creation, and foreign investment. But the plan doesn't stop at energy. Canada's mineral wealth, essential for renewable energy and battery production, is also getting a global spotlight. In response to soaring global demand, the Canadian government is accelerating exploration and development of key mineral deposits in provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. New policy initiatives, tax incentives, and partnerships with European and Asian tech manufacturers aim to position Canada as a secure and ethical source of battery-grade raw materials. Ottawa has also launched a critical minerals strategy aimed at securing domestic supply chains and reducing reliance on geopolitical hotspots such as the Democratic Republic of Congo or China. This positions Canada as a geopolitical counterbalance in the global race for green technology. The goal? To slash dependence on U.S. markets by at least 50% by 2025. That's not a small shift. That's a full-scale reorientation of a nation's trade policy, and one that could transform Canada into a central player in the 21st century global economy. What's holding Europe back? Ironically, even as the EU welcomes Canadian energy, some countries are dragging their feet. CETA still hasn't been ratified by all 27 member states. Concerns about food standards, sovereignty, and corporate courts have slowed the deal. In countries like France, Austria, and Italy, lawmakers have voiced skepticism about elements of CETA's dispute resolution mechanism, which some argue gives foreign corporations the ability to challenge national laws through private arbitration rather than public courts. Others worry that liberalized trade could lead to weakened protections for domestic agriculture, stricter labor standards, or erosion of environmental regulations. That said, the strategic stakes have shifted dramatically. The energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine changed everything. Suddenly, the cost of inaction became far greater than the risk of regulatory reform. Governments under pressure from industry groups and households facing skyrocketing utility bills have started to reevaluate their resistance. European industries, especially in Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, are suffering from high input costs due to limited gas and oil supply. Major manufacturing sectors like chemicals, steel, and automotive are at risk of shrinking or relocating. This has sparked calls for faster energy diversification, and Canada, with its stable democracy and environmental credentials, is viewed as a trusted alternative. Moreover, Canadian officials are offering stronger guarantees on sustainability, labor rights, and transparency, concessions aimed at easing European concerns. Behind closed doors, Canadian and European negotiators are reportedly working on side agreements or clarifications that could unlock ratification in remaining states. Now, energy security trumps red tape. European industries, suffering from high costs and unstable supplies, are begging Brussels to move faster. Will CETA finally become fully ratified as Canada sweetens the deal with more oil, gas, and minerals? The rise of the resource diplomacy era. We're entering a new phase of global relations, resource diplomacy. Nations aren't just trading goods, they're securing lifelines. Canada's move to rebrand itself as a global energy hub, not just America's northern backup, could reshape trade flows for decades. This transformation isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a larger trend where energy security and supply chain resilience are becoming pillars of national security strategies. The era of cheap, globalized energy is being replaced by an age where proximity, politics, and trust define partnerships. Countries are building alliances not just with military pacts or economic treaties, but through energy corridors, critical mineral cooperation, and cross-border grid integrations. In this landscape, Canada offers something rare: political stability, environmental accountability, and technological transparency. The EU sees a democratic, stable, environmentally conscious partner in Canada, and Canada sees a massive untapped market willing to pay premium prices for stable supply. New initiatives like the EU-Canada Green Alliance and raw materials cooperation frameworks are further deepening these ties. European countries are now exploring long-term joint investments in Canadian clean hydrogen projects, offshore wind infrastructure, and smart grid technologies. Meanwhile, Canada is deploying diplomatic energy attachés in strategic European capitals, mirroring how oil-rich Gulf nations expanded influence during the 20th century. These efforts are backed by strategic export credit agencies, green finance mechanisms, and climate-aligned investment mandates. But Washington might be losing a key part of its global energy advantage, and fast. If it doesn't adapt quickly to the new language of resource diplomacy, it risks being outmaneuvered, not just by rivals, but by its once reliable friends. The question is no longer whether resource diplomacy is here. The question is, who's writing the rules? What happens next? So, what if the pipelines to the US slow and the tankers to Europe speed up? Could American refineries be forced into costly overhauls? Will electric grids in the northern US face disruptions or rising costs? Could Canada eventually become Europe's energy Canada, not America's?
Canada, we'll see what happens with Canada, but the people of Canada would be paying less than half of the tax. Am I going to impose tariffs on the European Union? Absolutely.
Recently, when U.S. President Donald Trump imposed and then suspended tariffs on all Canadian products,
the implications of Canada's pivot go far beyond a reshuffling of trade routes. They could alter the foundational dynamics of North American energy security. As Canada increasingly integrates into the European and Asian energy landscape, it will likely reshape everything from commodity pricing models to global infrastructure investment patterns. American refineries may need to seek alternative heavy crude sources or pay a premium to retain Canadian contracts. That could raise consumer prices across the board and diminish the U.S. refining competitiveness. In the power sector, states like New York and Vermont may be compelled to renegotiate cross-border electricity agreements under less favorable terms. Meanwhile, Canadian provinces could redirect excess hydro and wind energy capacity to green hydrogen exports bound for European markets, particularly Germany, which is rapidly scaling hydrogen infrastructure. Furthermore, as Canada becomes more entrenched in EU energy frameworks and Asian LNG partnerships, its diplomatic posture will evolve. Canada may begin aligning with Brussels and Tokyo on energy standards, emissions frameworks, and clean tech subsidies, potentially putting it at odds with Washington on regulatory and strategic fronts. And here's the biggest question of all. Was this shift inevitable, or did U.S. trade aggression accidentally push its closest ally into the arms of its geopolitical rivals? One thing is clear: the next decade won't just be about energy supply. It will be about energy loyalty and the strategic alliances built around it. The energy map of the world is being redrawn right now, in real time. In Canada, long overlooked as a quiet supplier, is suddenly taking center stage. The United States must now decide, will it repair the relationship or risk losing a resource-rich ally? And can the EU move fast enough to lock in Canada's supplies before others do? Let us know what you think in the comments. Will this energy revolution make or break global alliances? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into global stories that shape our future.